Your credit score is 287, the loan officer said flatly. I blinked. That couldn't be right. There's also a problem, she continued. My hands wouldn't stay still. I set them flat on the desk between us. You have 47 credit accounts in active default. Total debt, $412,000. The room tilted. I'd never borrowed money in my life, never missed a payment, never opened most of those accounts. At 52 years old, I'd spent 3 decades working as a hospital administrator, building a reputation for integrity. I'd raised 2 children alone after my husband passed. I'd saved responsibly. I'd done everything right. And somehow, I was drowning in debt I never created. There must be a mistake, I said, my voice sounding far away. I need to see the accounts. I need documentation. The loan officer pulled up her screen and turned it toward me. The accounts scrolled past like a nightmare. Credit cards opened in 1987, the year I was born. Loans established before I could even sign my own name. Addresses I'd never lived at. Purchases I'd never made. Everything tied to my social security number. Everything in my name. My mother's name appeared on nothing. But I knew. In that moment, staring at decades of financial devastation, I knew exactly who had done this. I'd spent my entire adult life believing my mother was just difficult, just controlling, just overbearing. I'd attributed her obsession with my finances to mere nosiness. She'd always insisted on handling my tax documents. She'd always wanted to know my salary. She'd always had my social security number memorized. I'd never questioned why. The loan officer was still talking, but I couldn't hear her anymore. I stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor. I walked out of her office and into the hallway, where the fluorescent lights seemed too bright, too harsh. My phone was in my pocket. I pulled it out and called my mother. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful like it always was. "Hanana, I was just thinking about you. How's your day?" I couldn't speak. The words were there, but my throat had closed around them. "Hanana, are you there?" I ended the call. My fingers moved to my contacts and found my brother's number. Tomas. He lived 3 states away and we rarely spoke, but he needed to know. He needed to know what our mother had done. I called him. When Thomas answered, I told him everything. Every account. Every dollar. Every year. I heard him breathing on the other end of the line, heard his shock transforming into something darker. Anger. Recognition. "I've been wondering why my credit was destroyed," he said quietly. I just thought. I never connected it to her. We talked for 40 minutes. Tomas had discovered his own credit nightmare 2 years ago when he tried to buy a house. He'd assumed it was fraud, but the investigation had gone nowhere. The accounts were all legitimate. They were all in his name. His social security number, his identity, but he'd never opened them. "She's been doing this to both of us," he said, "probably for decades." I hung up and sat in my car in the parking lot. The afternoon sun beat down through the windshield. I needed to go back to work. I had a shift at the hospital in 2 hours. I had patients depending on me. I had a reputation to maintain. I had a life that suddenly felt like it was built on quicksand. But first, I needed to understand how deep this went. I drove home to my small house on Maple Street, a place I'd bought 5 years ago with my own money, my own credit, my own savings. Or so I'd thought. I pulled up my own financial records on my computer and started digging. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. Loans I'd never taken out. Credit cards I'd never activated. Accounts opened in cities I'd never visited. The pattern was unmistakable. Every few years, a new account would appear. Money would be borrowed against my name, my social security number, my identity. Then the account would go into default. The debt would accumulate. The damage would compound. My mother had been systematically destroying my credit since I was born. I found a notebook in my desk drawer and started writing down dates. 1987. Credit card opened at a department store in Portland, Oregon. I was born in 1972 in California. My mother had moved to Oregon for work that year. 1989. Another card opened. 1991. A personal loan. 1993. 2 cards opened simultaneously. The pattern continued, relentless and methodical. By the time I was 18, she'd created a financial history that made me look like a serial defaulter. And I'd never known. I'd never seen the bills. I'd never received the notices. She must have intercepted them. She must have had mail forwarded to addresses I didn't know about. She must have kept this secret for 35 years. My hands moved across the keyboard, pulling up more records, bank statements, collection notices, court judgments. There were lawsuits. There were garnishments. There were liens against properties I'd never owned. The financial destruction was comprehensive and complete. I called my workplace and said I was sick. I wasn't lying. My stomach felt like it was eating itself from the inside. The next morning, I drove to my mother's house. She lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the same town where I grew up. I'd visited her countless times over the years, sat at her kitchen table, listened to her complain about money, listened to her ask me about my salary, my savings, my financial plans. She'd always been interested in my money. I'd thought it was just concern. I parked on the street and sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to decide what I was about to do. If I walked through that door and confronted her, everything would change. My relationship with my mother would be over. My relationship with my brother would transform into something new, something built on shared betrayal. My understanding of my entire life would shatter. But it was already shattered. I was just going to make it official. I got out of the car and walked to her door. She answered before I could knock, as if she'd been waiting for me. Her face lit up with her usual smile, warm and welcoming and utterly false. "Hanana, what a surprise! Come in, come in!" I stepped into her living room. Nothing had changed. The same beige furniture, the same landscape paintings on the walls, the same smell of her perfume and the coffee she always had brewing. It was a room I'd known my entire life, and suddenly it felt like a stranger's house. "We need to talk," I said. My mother's smile faltered slightly. She gestured to the couch. "Of course, honey. What's wrong? You look upset." I remained standing. "I went to a loan officer yesterday. I was trying to refinance my mortgage." My mother's face went very still. "I have 47 credit accounts in default," I continued. "I have $412,000 in debt. I have lawsuits and judgments and liens, all in my name, all opened over the past 35 years, all of them fraudulent." The silence that followed was like a physical thing. My mother sat down slowly on the couch. She didn't deny it. She didn't look shocked. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know," she said finally, her voice very quiet. It wasn't a question. "I know," I confirmed. "How did you find out?" she asked. The question was so absurd, so completely missing the point, that I almost laughed. How did I find out? As if the discovery was the problem. As if the problem wasn't that she'd stolen my identity, destroyed my financial life, and done it all in secret for decades. "Does it matter?" I asked. My mother looked away. "I did it to protect you." Those words hit me like a physical blow. I had to sit down. I lowered myself into the armchair across from her, my legs suddenly unable to hold me up. To protect me, I repeated. You were a child, my mother said, still not looking at me. I was struggling. I had 2 children, no husband, no support. I needed money. I had access to your social security number. It seemed like a solution. You committed identity theft? I said flatly. You committed fraud. You've been committing fraud for 35 years. I always paid the bills, my mother said, finally looking at me. I paid them for years. I kept them current. I kept your credit clean. Until you didn't, I said. Until you stopped paying. Until you let them all default. My mother's jaw tightened. Things got harder. I got older. I couldn't keep up with all of them. And then I thought, you were old enough. You had a good job. You could handle it. The implication was staggering. She deliberately let my credit collapse, knowing that I would eventually discover it, knowing that it would be my problem to fix. She transferred the burden from her shoulders to mine as casually as if she were handing me a grocery list. I need you to explain exactly what you did, I said, pulling out my phone to record. Every account, every date, every amount. I need documentation. I need to know everything. My mother stood up. I'm not going to sit here and confess to crimes, Hanana. They're already crimes, I said. I'm just trying to understand the scope. I'm trying to figure out how to fix this. You can't fix this, my mother said, her voice hardening. This is your problem now. This is what you have to deal with. This is the consequence of my choices. The honesty was almost refreshing. She wasn't trying to minimize it or excuse it anymore. She was just stating facts. She'd made choices. I was suffering the consequences. That was how our relationship had always worked, I realized. That was how it had always been. I stood up and walked toward the door. I'm going to need all of your financial records. I'm going to need documentation of every account, every payment, every default. I'm going to need to know exactly what you did to my credit and my brother's credit, and I'm going to need a lawyer. You're going to sue me? My mother asked, her voice rising. Your own mother? I paused at the door. I'm going to do whatever it takes to fix my life. And if that involves legal action against you, then yes, I will. I left her house and drove directly to a lawyer's office. The attorney I met with, a woman named Feliana Morris, who specialized in identity theft cases, listened to my story with an expression of controlled fury. By the time I finished explaining everything, she was already pulling up forms. This is extensive, Feliana said, reviewing my notes. 35 years of systematic identity theft, multiple accounts, significant debt. This is a criminal matter, not just a civil one. You need to file a police report. I filed the police report that afternoon. The officer who took my statement, a man named Gavik McCoy, listened with the same controlled fury that Feliana had shown. He explained that what my mother had done was a felony. It was identity theft. It was fraud. It was wire fraud if any of the accounts involved online transactions. It was mail fraud if she'd intercepted mail. It was potentially multiple felonies, each one carrying significant prison time. Do you want to press charges? Officer McCoy asked. I sat with that question for a long moment. Pressing charges against my mother would mean prosecution. It would mean a trial. It would mean my private family dysfunction becoming a matter of public record. It would mean the end of any possibility of reconciliation or repair. But she'd already ended that possibility. She'd ended it 35 years ago when she'd first used my social security number. Yes, I said. I want to press charges. The legal process that followed was grueling and slow. Feliana worked with the prosecutor's office to build a case. They subpoenaed my mother's financial records. They traced the money. They documented the pattern. They built an ironclad case of systematic identity theft spanning decades. My brother Tomas became a co-victim in the case. His credit had been destroyed in the same way. He'd discovered similar accounts, similar defaults, similar financial devastation. Together, we represented nearly $800,000 in fraudulent debt. 3 months after I walked into the loan officer's office, I received a call from the prosecutor. My mother had been charged with 47 counts of identity theft, 47 counts of fraud, and multiple counts of wire fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was solid. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now she decides whether to go to trial or take a plea deal," the prosecutor said. "Either way, this will likely result in significant prison time." I hung up the phone and sat in my office at the hospital, staring at the wall. My mother was going to prison. My mother, who had raised me, who had changed my diapers, who had taught me to read and ride a bike and believe in myself, was going to go to prison for stealing from me. The grief and anger and betrayal were so tangled together that I couldn't separate them anymore. I called Thomas that night. We didn't talk about the case. We just sat on the phone together, not speaking, both of us processing the reality of what was happening. "She's going to prison," Tomas said finally. "Yeah," I said. "How do you feel about that?" I thought about the question. How did I feel? I felt angry. I felt betrayed. I felt violated. I felt the weight of 35 years of lies crushing down on me. I felt like I'd been living in someone else's life, wearing someone else's identity, paying for someone else's choices. But I also felt something else. Relief. Finally, there would be consequences. Finally, the truth would be out. Finally, I could start to heal. "I feel like I need to take my life back," I said. The months that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and financial reconstruction. I worked with Filiana and a credit repair specialist to begin the process of cleaning up my credit. We disputed fraudulent accounts. We filed documentation with the credit bureaus. We sent cease and desist letters to collection agencies. It was slow, meticulous work, but gradually my credit began to improve. I also discovered that my mother had done something else. She'd taken out several loans in my name, using my house as collateral. If she'd defaulted on those loans, I would have lost my home. The thought made me sick. She'd had that power over me, and I'd never even known it. Filiana helped me file additional charges related to the home equity fraud. The case against my mother grew larger and more serious with each passing week. 6 months after I first walked into that loan officer's office, my mother finally agreed to a plea deal. She would plead guilty to all charges. She would accept a sentence of 10 years in federal prison. She would be required to pay restitution to both me and Tomas, though the amount was far less than the actual damage she'd caused. The day she was sentenced, I sat in the courtroom and watched as my mother was led away in handcuffs. She didn't look at me. She didn't acknowledge me. She just walked out of the courtroom with her head down, and I realized that I felt nothing. No sadness, no pity, no maternal instinct to protect her or save her. She had stolen my identity and my future. She had made me a stranger to myself, and now she was going to pay for it. The years that followed were about rebuilding. I worked tirelessly to restore my credit. I paid down the fraudulent debt piece by piece, account by account. It took 3 years, but gradually, my credit score climbed from 287 back to something resembling normal. I was able to refinance my mortgage. I was able to rebuild my financial life. But the emotional damage took longer to heal. I went to therapy. I processed the betrayal. I grieved for the mother I'd thought I had, and the mother I actually had. I learned that what she'd done wasn't about protecting me. It was about control. It was about using me. It was about treating me as a resource rather than a person. My relationship with Thomas transformed. We became close in a way we'd never been before, bonded by shared trauma and shared survival. We talked regularly. We supported each other through the legal process. We helped each other heal. I also made the decision not to have contact with my mother. When she was released from prison after serving 8 years, I didn't reach out. I didn't visit. I didn't forgive. Some betrayals are too deep to bridge. Some relationships are too broken to repair. Today, 5 years after my mother was released from prison, I'm in a completely different place. My credit score is 760. I've paid off all the fraudulent debt. My house is secure. My financial life is stable. But more importantly, I've reclaimed my identity. I know who I am now. I know that I'm not defined by my mother's choices. I know that I'm capable of surviving betrayal and coming out stronger on the other side. I know that taking control of my life, even when it means cutting off family, is sometimes the most powerful thing you can do. My mother hasn't contacted me since her release. I don't know where she is or what she's doing. I don't know if she's sorry or if she still justifies what she did. And I've learned that I don't need to know. Her story ended when she stole my identity. My story continues, and it's mine alone. If you're discovering that someone you trusted has stolen your identity, don't wait. Contact the authorities. Hire a lawyer. Take your life back. You deserve to own yourself.